beautiful film is that everyone has got layers, everyone has got nuances, and Harge is complicated in his own right. In your performance, we sort of see how confused he is, that somehow he's been cheated out of the life he was expecting. How did you work to humanize him despite sort of some of the belligerence and the anger that he shows and the ways that we get to know that character? How did you get to those points underneath that?
Good direction. No, just listening to what you had just said, one of the really interesting aspects of playing this character, you know, he's what he is on the screen. But the way you just spoke about how you put it together, you left everything open for, at least for Harge anyway, to actually do as he will and define those spaces. And I think that was interesting because as I was playing it, it allowed me, I think at some point I realized that it could be a stereotypical character very easily and portray what you would imagine a guy from the 50s under these circumstances. But what happened is that at some point, the worst possible moment in a man's life, or a woman, and they're in love, is when they realize they're not in love anymore. And this character never realized he wasn't in love anymore. He was always in love, and he was intensely in love. And he also had this little child. And not just his wife, not just his child, but his family unit. So important to him, and so important to say nothing of his social status and what he was in. But he refused to give that up. So that, what you said, allowed me, I think, and the character to stay within that and never lose love or respect, but still be very confused on what is going on. And which goes back to that one direction you gave me when you're walking in the room and I look across and I go, who are you, basically? It's like, who are, and Todd gave me a specific direction there, and it really turned me. I was like, oh, yeah, okay. And anyway, it was, for me, this whole thing was so much fun, and it was really refreshing because of what the material is and just the way it was presented. It was, and then seeing it, and it was wonderful.
Sarah, Abby's friendship with Carol is so meaningful, but I also see her, Abby is sort of a window into the life Carol could be leading. Maybe she's sort of a guide to how to live it in some ways. What were some of the keys for you as you approached it? Because she sort of seems like Abby's like a beat ahead of, obviously, of Therese and Harge and maybe even Carol.
I really just tried to think about friendship and selflessness and kind of unwavering loyalty. Because I think Abby still has feelings for Carol. I do think I wonder what I personally would do if somebody I loved was still, had feelings for, if I sort of was called upon to come in and rescue the person that she currently loves. I don't know. It was, to me, it was a testament to her friendship and her love, and I think the desire to be around Carol and in Carol's orbit no matter what. I think Abby's sense of society, and I don't mean literal society, but her community, her friendships, they were probably quite narrow at that time. And so to lose something like that would be, the consequences of that, I think, would be too enormous. So,
Jake, if Harge is sort of one type of guy, one type of 1952 guy, Richard is another. When he says he's never been in love, then he sort of adds, until you, it's sort of like something he has to say. But there's a real nuance there, and I'm wondering if, as you were working into the character, you were finding the levels of subtlety, because it sort of feels like, Richard really sort of wants to sort of understand something about Therese, though he calls her Terry, sort of against her, it doesn't feel natural to call her Terry. But he really sort of has a sense of himself as a guy in 1952, and he asked her to marry him, and why doesn't she want to join? Was there a subtlety there that you were sort of going for that was naturally in the script?
Well, I'd say it was definitely in the script. I'd say any of that subtlety is not thanks to me, for sure. I think Todd spoke a little when we first met about the idea that for Richard, like the world is there to take. That he's young, he's in New York, he's first-generation American, he's smart, he's handsome, he has a job, he's got a girl, the world is his for the taking, and yet it slips away from him. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of, without knowing it, thank God that it does, because otherwise he's 15 years or 10 years earlier than Carol and Harge, and that world, if he and Therese stayed together and created a life that then wasn't a life anymore, you know? I don't know if I can speak to the subtlety. I think that may be a viewer experience more than my attempt at creating something. But I do think that it's really, to me, for Richard, it's the idea of a dream that then falls apart, or someone's not willing to be a part of that dream, and trying to wrangle them into it, and they're not meant to be there, you know.
Yeah, well, it's just interesting because in many ways, as Carol and Therese's love story is unfolding, the side characters, you know, Harge is sort of represents a little bit of the past, Richard is the future, or Abby is the future, and Richard is sort of the present, trying to understand things in a 1952 context, yeah. Let's take some questions. It's here in the front. Yeah.
But I would add that she's also exerting an authority over the situation by basically in a veiled threat to Harge, by saying, I want to see Rindy on my terms, and if not, this may come to court and this may get ugly. And one could only imagine how ugly this could get for someone like Harge and his family if this really did get played out in the courts. So she ends up actually holding the reins in her hand about how and when she gets to see her daughter, and that had not been the case up till that point in the story.
And that wasn't... Highsmith allows us a great freedom in the novel with the character of Carol, whose own narrative is relayed almost exclusively through Therese's eyes. So we get these shards, these mosaic pieces of Carol's life, and now Carol is doing this, and now I heard she was, you know, having a custody battle. But so it gave us great freedom because there is no big moment with Carol and Harge like that in the book, to actually explore some of these things and the power dynamic, so that it is less about will I lose my child? I personally don't think she's ever in danger of losing Rindy in a real sense.
But it is interesting, because what your question does point to is the fact that if a mother makes a choice based on her own survival, that she risks losing the audience's sympathy. And I don't, you know, if it was a gay man, somehow I don't think the question of sympathy would arise. And whenever one plays a mother on screen, there's always a sense that there's a right way to parent, and that you lose your identity and you become a mother first and foremost. And I think that that's what I loved about Todd, is we didn't ever talk about sympathy. And personally, as an actor, I find the idea of playing for an audience's sympathy a kind of repulsive endeavor. It's like saying, like me, like me. I think it's a terrible, terrible position, a tragic position that Carol has been placed in. And Harge has been placed in, frankly. You know, when she says in the lawyer's office, we're not ugly people, Harge, I think that's when the threat goes out of it. It's like, that is the truth. You are not like this at your heart if you take away all the trappings of society. I am not like this. And I think that's the issue. And the wonderful thing about working with Todd is we didn't ever discuss the sympathy, the S word.
I also think that towards that end, when Harge is looking through that doorway at Abby's, it's interesting because, speaking a little bit to what you're saying, there's a world going on around him that he's not privy to, that he's not allowed into, and he's confused by it. So his heart may want something else, but there's this whole other situation that these other two hearts have going on that he just doesn't understand, and he's not able to unlock it, right, Todd? Is that a fair assessment of that scene?
Well, yes, clearly. I mean, I think you see the two sort of satellites,
Yeah.
the key sort of power brokers on either side of Carol's life, coming in direct conflict with each other in that scene. And it's the only scene that neither Carol or Therese witness in the film. And I think that gives it an extra kind of force. But it's an essential scene, and it's a showdown about people who love Carol in different ways and sort of keep disavowing the other person's side. But they're strong people too. And the interesting thing about Kyle's character, Harge, is that we are introduced to Harge at an uncustomary period in his in his life as a character. One presumes that Harge has always pretty much taken Carol for granted most of their life. But when the film begins, he's already sort of reevaluated her value in his life. And the way he's inviting her out and wanting to have time, spend time with her and share time with her seems to be a new project, a new regimen.
Right here, middle row on the right-hand side.
There are some very interesting moments that speak of addiction, that counters the desire moments, the smoking I'm talking about, that when Carol wants the cigarettes in that scene. Could you talk about where the smoking comes in? There's another scene where a woman is hiding her smoking. They all have their secrets.
Yeah.
Well, it's 1952. Everybody smoked.
But smoking is the perfect sort of conductor of desire because it's a way in which you seek desire and you never fulfill it. So it's this practiced, I mean, I know this from being an ex-smoker. We've talked about this. It's a practiced sort of cycle where you seek being satisfied, you crave that moment, but you're always chasing an original moment that you never get back to in that cigarette. And so, of course, it's played a key symbolic role in the history of Hollywood Golden Age cinema and the history of films about women and the ways in which anxieties and desires are, displaced into other kinds of practices. But I don't see it as much more than that in this film.
But that was a great description, and I really want a cigarette right now. Oh my gosh.
I'm just going to spin off. I'm going to spin off of that for a second. Just talk about something else that's a signifier in some ways in the film, which is the way it was shot, the 16 millimeter. Can you talk to us a little bit, Todd, about the choice to shoot the film in 16 millimeter and having it be so era specific, but also very evocative at the same time?
Ed Lockman, the director of photography, and I had worked on Super 16 in our previous project, Mildred Pierce, which was going ultimately broadcast for HD TV on HBO. And we wanted to really downgrade the sort of sophistication of lenses and stocks today, where the grain element just continually goes away. You don't even know you shot on film if you shot on 35 sometimes, and it blows up to HD. And we loved it. We had a really great time on that project. And the research for Carol kept revealing this city in a very early stage of transition out of the war years. The early 1950s were something quite different from the Eisenhower war years that we mostly attribute to that shiny, glossy decade. And I was quite interested and curious about how different this world looked than the world perhaps in my film Far From Heaven. And we wanted to bring some of that sootiness and some of that sort of monochromatic color palette to the look of the film, and so the 16 millimeter was one of the ways that we did that. We also found a beautiful city that had architectural integrity and was really preserved in its past in many blocks and in many of the interiors we found in Cincinnati, Ohio. We just loved what Cincinnati offered, the look of it.
In the back, Grace shirt there on the left, yes.
Hi. Another one of the things I noticed was obviously the two women are in very different life stages. Carol being more established and having children and married.
Older.
Old. No, but that doesn't always.
We can say that word.
I think it would be very different had Carol been a man. Obviously, it becomes a different story because she is kind of helping Therese sort of find herself and asking her questions and encouraging her to do new things. I wonder if that gave you more, because you're both women, it gave more freedom for it not to feel like, for lack of a better term, like predatory. That's it. Maybe that was a sloppy question, but I hope you understand what I mean.
I mean, I don't know. Would it ever feel predatory? I mean, it's not like I'm 17 years old. Therese is younger than Carol, and she certainly, they are at different stages in their lives, but I don't think that she's so young that it never felt predatory to me, and I don't think it ever really would have, male or female.
I mean, the interesting thing about this is the obsession, and actually perhaps more so in the book, there's this pursuit, this obsessive pursuit that Therese has of Carol, and because of Carol's sense of consequence and the difference in their ages and experiences, and also their different socioeconomic backgrounds, it's there's a sense of just how we have to quiet the horses here and not go too quickly with this, because I know that this is not necessarily going to end well. So it's kind of in a way that she's just but that's delicious stuff to play with, because that's what loads up all those silences, and every word is not only carefully chosen by the beautiful screenplay, but by the women. Can I say this? This might have two meanings. I'm not sure that was taken the right way. Did I just hear what I thought you were saying behind what you just said? It's wonderful stuff to play with this, because there's so much stuff between them and keeping them apart.
There are also things that a modern audience has to keep reminding ourselves were quite different at this time, where, counterintuitively, where an older woman could invite a younger woman to lunch, and it was absolutely totally appropriate, where she would never have invited the head of the ski department to lunch, or they could check into a motel together as two women, but if they were a heterosexual unmarried couple checking into a hotel at this time, it would have been scandalous. So there's ways in which the mores and the codes of the time are also things that we're learning and reading against their actions and gestures.
Plus, let's not forget, Therese knows what she's doing when she sends the package, when she sends the gloves back, too. Yeah, she absolutely knows what she's doing, yeah. In the back, right-hand side, here, right on the aisle.
Hi, my question is for Ms. Blanchett. You first were in Patricia Highsmith work with The Talented Mr. Ripley, which I think is a marvelous film, and I was wondering if you encountered The Price of Salt while you were working on that, and if your perception of the story changed having portrayed Carol.
Yes, it's one thing entirely reading a novel and then reading it again when you're coming to play a character in that book. I mean, I just read everything I could of hers at the time we were making Ripley, and it was actually, much to my shame, the first time I encountered her work. But I also was very interested in all of the sort of the filmic incarnations of her. Of her works as well, and went back and revisited it. And there's some wonderful, observations and in parts of internal monologue that more internal monologue that Therese has, but observations of Carol that are in the novel that were really, really useful to read, that I just read at the time, the first time I read the book as a reader, but to try and make that stuff manifest was really exciting.
Way in the back, hand far right, yeah.
Todd, can you comment on Kyle's performance and the qualities in him as an actor that caused you to cast him in this role? And Kate, can you comment on working with Kyle and his process?
Good Lord.
What can I say? I just so lucked out. I mean, I've been watching Kyle's work and been so amazed by it, as I'm sure most of you guys have in Friday Night Lights and films he's been in. And casting a man to play opposite Kate Blanchett is not an obvious task, because a lot of male actors today are kind of grown-up boys or something, or wear their baseball caps still or something, and it just doesn't. You need to have a real grown-up, I think, opposite Kate.
You can have an animal.
And we found an animal in Kyle. No, but it's true. You need, and I think you get what I mean, and because it's even just the way he enters that era with such a sense of believability. It's like, I saw him in The Close the first time, and I was like, I think you said you'd done a early dramatic TV show set in the 50s.
Homefront in the 40s.
Homefront in the 40s. But it just suited him so well. It was so utterly believable, And, but, this started with the writing. The way Harge is handled as a character, and Richard, Highsmith is quite hard on these men in the book. And so Phyllis brought a very different kind of complexity and ambiguity to the characters. And you felt, you understood that they were in a place without any examples around them for what they were going through. And they were struggling, and they were doing their very best, and they were lashing out at times and being reactive or being defensive, but they were human. And I think Kyle just brings that completely to the front of the